Hello and welcome to Unit 7. This week we're going to focus on aquatic life and ecological connections. As you've learned, in many environmental flow assessments, the main objective is the preservation or even restoration of ecological structure and integrity, and the services, therefore, that a healthy functioning ecosystem provides. So it's important that we learn something about the structure and function of ecosystems. So our learning objectives will first be to have a basic knowledge of the different forms of aquatic life and riparian vegetation. That's the biotic structure of the system. Second, we want to understand how aquatic and riparian organisms are linked together in food webs, an exchange of energy, a dynamic that sustains the system. This is part of the function, and we'll talk about other parts of it. And finally, we want to understand how each of these is influenced by flow, linking it back to the flow regime. So let's begin with some of the simplest of organisms, primary producers. Illustrated here are algae on the left. We have cyanobacteria, actually a photosynthesizing bacterium, at the bottom. These two often occur together in associations that are called periphyton. We can see an example of that here, floating on the surface of this lake. And on the right, we see macrophytes. So these are flowering plants that are growing in the substrate, the base of the river, and both providing habitat for other organisms, providing energy to the system in the loss of their own leaves, and also influencing the hydraulics of the system, acting as buffers to flow. When we look at corridors in riparian areas, trees, shrubs, and bushes are important components of the system. Now, these are specially adapted plants generally to be able to tolerate the high levels of moisture that we find in riparian soils. They're providing a lot of services themselves. Their structure, the cover they provide, modulates the temperature of streams and the edges of rivers. They're also providing, of course, a wide variety of services for humans. The wood that they supply, there might be medicinal and other valued services that come from riparian vegetation. Also primary producers, photosynthesizing with the light of the sun. Now, we move to the next category, which are the decomposers or the secondary producers. And in this case, there are two different forms of microorganisms, bacteria on the left, fungi, important components of the system for beginning to break down what may be indigestible material that comes from plants, making it more palatable or digestible by other organisms. We have a variety of mollusks and crustaceans that live in stream and river systems, and they make their living in different ways. They might be filter feeders, filtering organic material and other tiny organisms from the flowing water, or they might act as predators as well. They're often scavenging in these systems. And then there's a very large community, huge variety of insects living in river systems. And some of the most important groups are shown here. You might be aware that the insects exhibit very different levels of tolerance to water quality and perhaps flow regime as well. So they're often used as indicators of the ecological health, the water quality of river systems, but they also perform very important functions. Again, consuming very often the organic material that is accumulating in rivers, transforming it into high protein body parts that are consumed by larger organisms. Fish in particular. So these are the most charismatic, visible components of biotic communities. There are nearly 10,000 different kinds of freshwater fish in the world, and they also are very often the object of environmental flow conservation programs. And they exhibit a wide variety of feeding styles. acting as predators, of course, but also scavengers, and they might be feeding on detritus as well. They're operating at many different trophic levels. And then we come to the reptiles, the amphibians, salamanders, toads, frogs, the like. These tend to occur in smaller numbers and tend to be predators, as we can see demonstrated very clearly in these two photographs. Now, it's also important to recognize not only the organisms living in the river itself, but organisms such as birds that are very often active in river corridors and in the water itself. Here we have a collection of water birds that you'll recognize as ducks and cranes and cormorants and the like. These also play a very important role, most often as a predator in the system, so consuming the organisms inside the river. But these birds are very often the objectives of our conservation programs, so they may be conservation targets. And they occur in such a wide variety of forms. I've shown the wading birds or the water birds previously, but this little bird, the American dipper, it may not look like it as you look at the photograph of it, but it's an extraordinary swimmer and diver. There's an image here of the bird diving to the bottom of a stream and hunting for insects living among the cobbles at the bottom. At the bottom here, I've got a link for you to a YouTube video that illustrates this really well. You'll be surprised how well this little bird swims. It actually has a second eyelid that enables it to see clearly underwater, a clear eyelid. So check that out if you get a chance. And finally, we have mammals occurring. Now again, a relatively small number. Some of the most important are shown here. You'll recognize the hippopotamus from African rivers, the beaver from northern rivers around the world, and even dolphins, as are shown here. Dolphins occurring in different river systems of the world. This happens to be an Amazon dolphin. And these organisms may be predators, and in this case, with both the hippopotamus and the beaver, they also act as animal engineers, actually restructuring the river system. You may be familiar with the habit of beaver to fell trees, to cut down trees at the margin of rivers, and to build dams that actually create ponds behind them. The hippopotamus also is entering and leaving the water regularly to feed on grasses and adjacent areas, and that process of entering and leaving cuts large gullies in the edges of rivers, riparian zones, and they also maintain pools in the rivers themselves. They also return a lot of terrestrial organic material that they feed on during the night. They return that to the river during the day in the form of their feces. So they're also a source of energy, a source of terrestrial derived energy to river systems. So when we put all of these different kinds of organisms together, the structure is the distribution of different organisms present, but the dynamics between them start taking us into the area of function. What's illustrated here is a food web. We can see the original source of energy as being the sun, that energy being converted into organic material by primary producers, and then a whole series, a chain of interactions, a web of interactions of that energy being transferred up the trophic levels to some of the higher species, such as fish, the birds that we saw. We can even see an illustration here of where the energy, the nutrition that comes from these organisms is consumed by terrestrial organisms like the bear that you see there. Let me point out that you may not see an excellent version of the slide here, so it's best if you open up the PowerPoint beside the presentation and follow along in the slide presentation mode. You've probably already done that. Now, these interactions, we saw an example in the previous slide of a bear feeding on fish. These terrestrial aquatic transfers of material are actually quite common. The hippopotamus was another example of that, bringing terrestrial organic matter into the stream. These are the results of an interesting study by some Japanese scientists that looked at a number of different forest bird species that lived in the riparian forest, also of trout and fish living in the streams, and they looked at the prey that those organisms were consuming. And they distinguished between terrestrial prey, so terrestrial insects primarily, and aquatic prey, aquatic insects, or the aquatic form of different insects. And these lines show the distribution of feeding of each. So in the case of rainbow trout, you can see that it's feeding heavily on both terrestrial and aquatic prey. And that characteristic holds for many of the bird species, the rest of the fish species as well. There's an exchange of energy between the riparian zone and the aquatic system itself. Maintaining that linkage is critical. So what we're talking about now, this food web, exchange of energy in the system, is one component of what is river metabolism, the function of the system, the function that then yields services that we as humans depend upon. In its totality, river metabolism is the sum of all chemical processes that occur within the river system in order to maintain life. It's that culmination of processes that lead to vitality of life in the river system. Herbivory and predation are characteristics of that we saw linking the different parts of a food web, but other important components of that system, and we'll say a little bit more about some of them, or one of them, reproduction, as we go forward. But reproduction and competition are also fundamental ecological processes influencing the structure as well as the function of aquatic ecosystems, and it's our objective very often to maintain those functions as well. So now let's turn our attention to some of the ways that organisms are adapted to live within riverine systems. Adaptations to live in this environment of a constant flow of water. And we see adaptations of three different types. Adaptations in the body form, in the behavior of organisms, and also in their life histories. And I'll say more about that as we go forward. So here's an example at the top of an insect, a mayfly larvae, and the hydrodynamic shape of its body. Fish also, of course, have this hydrodynamic shape. It reduces the drag on the organism. Strength and stamina are also important characteristics of organisms in order to be able to move and swim against the current. Some have adapted hooks and adhesives to hold them onto rocks or other substrate in the river itself. And others have developed the habits, the behavior of seeking shelter, perhaps down in the substrate of the stream or in riffle areas, not riffle areas, but eddies where flows are reduced, and they're able to find shelter from that constant force of the flowing water. This is a combination of evolutionary adaptations as well as some behavioral adaptations of organisms to enable them to live in this flowing water environment. Here's another example of a fascinating adaptation of the caddisfly larva. You can see that it constructs a net to capture organic material and other food stuffs that are flowing in the river. So they use the flow of the river to bring the food to them, and they capture it in this way. And this is a dramatic example of this filter feeding process of many other organisms. This is not itself filter feeding, but it's that waiting in the flow of the water and collecting the material that you're going to consume as it flows by. So, as we summarize this section, we've seen that river and stream organisms are finely adapted to life in flowing water, as well as spatial and temporal variability in flow regimes, the high flows and the areas in which they can seek shelter. Spatial variability in flow creates habitats that are more or less suitable for specific species. By more or less suitable, I mean that it is suitable for them, or it's optimally suitable, or not. It's not ideal habitat for those organisms. And many organisms are also dependent on seasonal, annual, and interannual changes in flow levels at different times of their life cycle. Now, this is the life history component that we're going to say more about. But first, with this slide, I'd like to illustrate a bit about the influence of flow on the availability of habitats. Now, in your slide presentation, you've got to make sure that you're looking at this in slideshow mode, or you'll see it obscured by some of the items that are going to come up in the animation. But this is an example of a river corridor in Africa. You can see the verdant, the green corridor of riparian vegetation taking advantage of access to water flowing in this stream. We can see some elephants in the river and in the riparian area utilizing this habitat, of course drinking from the stream, but also perhaps taking advantage of other services that are provided to them by a healthy riparian system. And we can see that this is a system that currently has very low flow levels. At the top here is a graphic that is a flow duration curve. And this is a simple representation of the distribution of different flow levels in a river over whatever record of data you have. Now, on the y-axis, we have flow in cubic meters per second. On the x-axis, we have the percent of time that that flow level is exceeded. So the way that works is that as we come to the far right, to the lowest flow levels, we see those are the levels that are, of course, exceeded most of the time. So we're approaching 100% of the time that at least this much water is flowing in the river. But as those flow levels increase, the percentage of time, the number of days, the number of hours that those flows persist in the river decrease until ultimately we reach the very highest flows that occur in the rivers, and those, of course, happen for only very brief periods of time, perhaps only once every several years. Now, in this case, in this moment, these low levels of flow in this river represent probably a point about here on a flow duration curve. And we can see that at this point, the flow is constrained to the mineral bed of the river. That's the habitat that's accessible at this moment to aquatic organisms living in the river. And of course, riparian organisms are able to access those adjacent areas as well. But now, as flow rises, we see, oh, my animation is not working. In your slide, what you'll see is you'll see a blue representation of increased flow in the river. And what we see is an inundation of adjacent areas, an activation, as far as the aquatic organisms are concerned, of other habitats. This low aquatic vegetation is being inundated at the edge of the river. They're accessing new habitat and utilizing it if it provides specific advantages to them. And then those high flows that occur infrequently, they actually work their way up the river margin, the river bank, to higher levels. They're now inundating some of this higher riparian vegetation, perhaps sending cues to that vegetation, as we'll see a little bit later, but opening up even more habitat, new opportunities for the aquatic organisms living in the stream. So over the course of a year, during a season, between one year and another, there's a constant dynamic linked to the variability in flow that is controlling the quantity of habitat that's present in the system. I see that I have it twice. So now you can see the illustration of the growing flow levels that are flooding this area. Now, two scientists from Australia, Stuart Bunn and Angela Arthington, have organized the various ways that flow influences ecology into 4 simple principles that I'd like to present quickly now, and it's also available in your reading. Here we have the simplest representation of a flow hydrograph. With low base flows, we enter a period of higher flows, and eventually those flows drop again. This might be an individual event, but more likely this is a seasonal pattern. And in this particular example, think of it in a seasonal flow regime fashion. And the dotted lines give us a sense for the range of variability, the variability in what those flow levels might be from one year to the next. So as we look at the first principle, the first principle reflects the influence of flow on determining the channel form, the complexity of habitat, and the disturbance regime that that habitat is subjected to. And those combined influence strongly the biotic diversity, the biotic composition, the biotic structure of that system. Second, we'll look at the influence of flow on the life history pattern. So now we're focusing on life history. Life history is events in the annual and in the entire lifespan of organisms. It's the time in which plants are flowering each year. It's the time in which fish are spawning. It's the sequence, the frequency with which insects are emerging from their aqueous phase in rivers. So these are those aspects in the life cycle of an organism, and we can see that many aspects of flow influence that. The onset of high waters might trigger organisms that it's time to reproduce. It's triggering them to recognize that new habitats are being activated, are being opened up for them, that they can move into and reproduce or feed, whatever it might be. Seasonal predictability, we can see, is very important in this. The variability in space, on flood flows, is important for them, and the stability of base flows. We'll see some examples of these as we go forward. Principle 3 focuses on connectivity, both lateral connectivity, up and downstream, as longitudinal conductivity, up and downstream, and lateral conductivity, which is connectivity into adjacent areas such as floodplains, which are very important habitat for organisms. We'll see some examples of that. Then finally, Principle 4 just recognizes the importance of flow, and especially a natural flow regime, in discouraging the invasions or discouraging invasions by exotic species. And it's simply a recognition that in these highly dynamic systems, the organisms who are present are those that are specially adapted with adaptive advantages that enable them to succeed in these environments. And when flow regimes are changed, that opens up the opportunity for exotic species that are not adapted to this level of variability or the particular disturbance regimes that occur there. It opens up opportunities for them to invade. Now let's step through each of these principles and just show you a couple of examples so you can really visualize this and think about it in the context of the river systems that you're focusing on in this course. So Principle 1, and that principle is that flow is a major determinant of physical habitat in streams, which is in turn a major determinant of biotic composition. So we have illustrations of two different streams or aquatic systems here. One on the left where we can see the overhanging riparian vegetation providing cover. We see large trees, logs in the river. This is a stream that is indicative of some higher energy flow regimes at particular times, variability in flow. And we see some macrophytes growing on the edge there. They are going to be rooted in substrates, more sandy substrates, that are appropriate for their growth. In this case, we see a much slower moving, probably lower disturbance regime with large areas of macrophytes growing in substrate on the bottom. Now, these macrophytes have become so abundant that they're also influencing flow. They're baffling the velocity of flow. So we can see that feedback also beginning in this case. This is an example of a couple of different species of mayflies and how their structure, remember Principle 1 focuses on how the variability in flow is influencing the structure, so the different species that are successful in a given regime. This is an example of 2 mayflies, and we can see the relative abundance of those mayflies under a variety of conditions. We can see that along the bottom, what is varying is the velocity of the flow of water at the point where the organisms have been captured. And we can also see variability in the substrate size, and substrate size being the size of the solid material in the stream, as well as variability in depth. And just note the clear responses of the abundance of these organisms to changes along each of those axes. I've also embedded here a small video that you can download at the link that's shown just to see one of these mayflies in action. It's a very short video. Now let's look at fish. Let's think about fish. Let's look at trout in particular, also often a target of our environmental flow efforts. And trout, of course, require a lot of structure for the habitat that is suitable for them is a habitat that includes a lot of structure like you see here that provides cover for them and also provides habitat for some of the insects that they might be feeding on. Trout often live in rivers, as we see on the left here, and that river, you can see that the water levels are very low right now, so they require sufficient flow levels for them to be able to make their way up and down the system. We'll get to that in principle number 3 as well. Depths, velocities, and cover are important habitat characters for fish, and in this case for trout in particular. Now, let's look now at the influence of flow regime on the functional attributes of fish. Now, this is an area of relatively little research, but an area of very active research now, the relationships between flow variability and ecological function. Now, this is a study that illustrates differences between, you can see that the y-axis is also the proportion of whatever is being measured in this particular case. So these are, the y-axis is just showing a greater proportion as the bars become larger. We're distinguishing between sites with, or species that live within variable flows versus species that live in more stable flow environments. And I want to focus your attention on just 2 aspects that are shown here. This graphic is showing the different ways, the different trophic approaches of the organisms. And here, these are the more omnivorous species, the species that can make use of a variety of different food sources. And just note that there's an especially large abundance of organisms that are adapted to variable flow environments in that category of omnivore. Equally, here, this is a measure of the tolerance of the organisms to high sediment levels. And we see a higher tolerance among those fish species that live in variable flow environments, and a lower tolerance relative to the stable variety, a higher proportion of intolerant species that are found in those stable environments. So we can see relationships here between the functional attributes, the way that they feed, the tolerance that they have to levels of sediment in rivers. We can see that varying as a function of the flow regime in which those organisms live. Principle 1. Now, Principle 2. Principle 2 applied to the life history stages of different organisms. And this is an example. We've got an example of 3 different fish species here that behave quite differently in their spawning practices. The Australian smelt, a very small fish, actually spawns in the low flow period before high water, before spring floods in Australia. The Colorado pike minnow actually spawns during the highest water periods, and that holds as well for the Clanwilliam yellowfish. So each of these species will be cued by the water level and perhaps the water temperature, which also has an important influence on and triggering particular behaviors, particular stages in the life cycle. During the low, warmer waters, the Australian smelt will be cued to spawn. As water levels rise and temperatures drop, the pike, Colorado pike minnow, will be cued to spawn. And the Colorado pike minnow will also make use of gravel bars that are produced during these high water periods. And imagine how that rise in water is a cue across the entire length of river to species that may be distributed widely. It's a cue for them to come together around these gravel bars for spawning. You have a note about in the text below about the clan-willing yellowfish as actually being a species that has responded well to the reintroduction of flows and spates in more regulated systems downstream of a dam, for example. Riparian vegetation as well can be cued in its stages of life history by changes in flow. Now these are modeling data, but for this river what we see is in blue we see the variability of flow, and the graph lines are indicating the drop in seeds by this particular plant. And we can see that as water levels rise, so too does the release of seeds of this cottonwood species. And we see that the seed drop actually hits its maximum sometime after the flood. So the floodwaters have receded, leaving moist substrate, perhaps newly created substrate, and along the edges of the river. And that's the point. That's the point in time at which the tree is dropping its seeds for germination. Those are ideal times, and it's cued by that change in flow. There's communication going on between organisms and the flow regime of the river. Principle 3 is about connectivity, and of course the most well-known example of the importance of connectivity is in the migration of salmon, which migrate in many parts of the world, generally more northern or southern high latitude rivers, but those species spend a period of their life in the ocean. They migrate back into rivers, ultimately into streams where they spawn, and that maintenance of connectivity is critical to the survival and the vitality of that species. A less well-known but equally remarkable story occurs in the Amazon, where a number of large catfish also migrate over thousands of kilometers during different phases of their life cycle. In this case, they spawn in the foothills of the Andes, in the blue area in the graphic there, and then the young fish are washed downriver, and over the course of a few weeks are washed all the way down to the estuary of the Amazon, which acts as a nursery for them, with high nutrients, high productivity, and they grow in that estuarine environment until finally beginning the long migration back upriver, thousands of kilometers. Now, these are also important species for fisheries, and there are fishers communities all along the river that are capturing these fish both for their own nutritional value, but also to sell them. So a clear and direct link to human livelihoods there. Thinking about lateral connectivity, this is just an illustration to demonstrate how much habitat can be opened up. These are satellite images of the Mississippi River in North America. And this is the Mississippi before the flood, an especially large flood that occurred in 1993. And this is the extent of the river, the extent of the flooded area during that flood. And you can see that very large areas of habitat have been opened up to species within the river, and will be maintained for some days or some weeks. That varies greatly between different rivers. But flooding expands rivers, connects rivers to floodplains, and opens up, activates new habitats, important habitats in the life cycle of a given organism. And finally, for this example, I want to point out the life history and the importance of connectivity of the tambaqui, a very popular fish also from the Amazon, a fish that lives in the lower parts, the central and lower parts of the Amazon, and that inhabits both rivers, flooded forests, as well as lakes. And you can see that this species is using all of these habitats at different times of its life. It spawns in the river, but it's a fruit-eating fish primarily. So after spawning, it uses the riparian area, the flooded forest as a nursery area for the fish to grow, but then also as an important source for the fruits that the fish eat. Those are falling from the trees, which actually live in that flooded forest. They also make use of lakes. So the dashed line is just an illustration of the kind of behavior, the movement of a species like this, and again, an illustration of the importance of maintaining that connectivity, and that connectivity is maintained by keeping water levels high enough to flood the entire area. And now for Principle 4, looking at the importance of flow regime for controlling invasive species. Now these are images of the Colorado River, and they're lovely images, and we can see on the left a ribbon of green along the edges of this river, and that ribbon of green is primarily tamarisk, an invasive species that would not normally be there, except that the flow regime has been controlled in this river, and what previously were large floods that would come down annually or seasonally down the river and wash these adjacent areas of vegetation, maintain sandy beaches, sandy point bars. Those floods no longer come down the river except under controlled releases from particular dams, and therefore the organisms, the tamarisk has invaded these areas and is beginning to constrain the river. Now there are some advantages that come with additional riparian vegetation, but in this case the tamarisk grows so tightly that it actually is inhibiting, it's reducing the habitat available to organisms that make use of these areas. This is just another illustration here. And let me end with a sequence of images that show this process taking place. This is Flaming Gorges Dam, which was built between 1958 and 1964, and these images show the river downstream of that dam. So if we go before the time of the dam, even though the image is not great, we can see a wide and open river corridor with a lot of complexity, a lot of habitats that are available as this river goes up and down during different periods of time. This is a view just at about the time when the dam was about to be constructed, and a similar thing. We see it at a different flow level, and we see the opening up of habitats, and undoubtedly a community of organisms that are adapted to that variability, taking cues from changes in flow regime and also utilizing the habitat that is opened up with those changing flows. Here, though, as we move into the 1980 and 1999 images, we see the river after the closure of the dam, when the flow variability is no longer as great as before, and we see then the invasion of the tamarisk that is narrowing the channel, constraining it, and reducing the habitat that is available to organisms living in the river system itself. All right? This graphic pulls it all together. This is an illustration of the Susquehanna River. This is an annual distribution in flow over the record of flow that exists in the area. You can see that the light blue records the highest flows that have occurred on any given day, and then the other shading covers different intervals of frequency in that distribution. Think back to the flow duration curve that we saw before, and there's a similar relationship to the ranges of frequency that occur here. And what we can see is we can see a clear seasonal pattern. The fall, winter, spring, summer times are indicated on this graph. We can see that spring is the time of important floods in the system. But also superimposed on this graphic are indications of what is the ecological relevance of that flow regime at different points of the year. So we can see a distinction between ecologically significant aspects of the high flow regime in blue, the seasonal flows, these are the high water periods, are shown in orange, and also the ecological importance of the low flows, which are shown in red. And if we just focus, you can go through in more detail the many different ecological needs related to flow, but let's just look at the ones that are related to those highest flows. We can see that fall floods are a cue for diadromous, for migrating fish to begin their migration. We can see that winter high flows are important for scouring ice and reducing the buildup of ice in the system, keeping water open. It also is maintaining floodplain connectivity during the winter. These spring flows serve a variety of purposes, maintaining the channel morphology, working to form islands which create new habitat, and also influencing the floodplain habitat. And then in the summer, those high flows are transporting organic matter and fine sediment, promoting vegetation growth. But we can see that a whole variety of other important needs are also being met during that crucial summer productivity time, and those needs are distributed across a number of different flows. Not just one, but a number of different flow levels are required to meet the full range of ecological needs of these species. So let's summarize what we've learned in this time and what you'll be exploring more in your readings and in the online discussions among your fellow classmates, but also among the teaching staff of the course. We found that river and stream corridors are inhabited by a high diversity of species that interact in food webs to maintain the ecological function of the system. So biotic structure in the composition of organisms that are present, physical structure in the geomorphology of the system, which is also strongly influenced by flow, combining to influence and maintain function, which ultimately yields services to humans. River and stream organisms are finely adapted to life in flowing water, as well as spatial and temporal variability in flow regimes. And a given flow regime will have a specific biotic composition of organisms that are specially adapted to the conditions in that stream. Spatial variability in flow creates habitats that are more or less suitable for specific species, right? This is telling us that as the flow regime changes, it's going to alter the habitat suitability for particular species. We'll talk more about that in the section on softwares that are available that are trying to optimize the habitats that are present for organisms. And finally, seasonal, annual, interannual changes in flow levels create needed habitats at different times in the life cycles of many species and provide connectivity between habitats. A critical relationship between flow, biotic structure, biotic function, and the services that are derived for them. It's for those reasons that we're working to preserve an environmental flow regime that makes these habitats available, sends the proper cues to organisms, and the many other important aspects that we've touched on in this lecture. So there's a lot of literature. You only have a little bit, as you'll see on eCampus, that you're required to read, but there's a rich variety of literature that's also available to you. You have all of the details to find those studies. So dig into it and enjoy the week. Thank you.